Wasted money on cures. Forgot how to fix myself. They say that time is free. Then why is it so precious? Oh, I'll save memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. Time is running out. Time is running out. Lately I've lost my track. I've sailed the deeper seas, hoping to find something to bring back better times. Oh, I'll save memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. But time is running out. 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 Time is running. Time is running out. But time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over. They can't be over now. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over now. Time is running out. Time is running out. Time is running out.
Okay, hi there. Welcome. Sunday afternoon, 5 o'clock. Time is running out. Well, not really. We've got time yet, and this is a great chance for the group to get together for one last time, as Ariane Grande would say, to discuss some economics ahead of paper 2, which is tomorrow, I think. I know it is. That's why we're doing it today. Purpose of this is to have just a Q&A for 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. We might carry on, but we won't go on beyond midnight. Just those of you who are worried about the time aspect of this session. And the idea here is if you post a question, put Q first in the chat. We'll try and pick out some questions. We've got quite a few we're going to go through. Our aim might be to answer, 20, 25 questions in this session. And they'll have a bit of fun along the way as well. We might be announcing our Tutor Due Economist of the Year. That could be coming up shortly. We have a shortlist. Here we go. So let's look at some questions. Darren's first one. By the way, those of you in the Tutor Due community, hundreds of you, fantastic collective. Thank you, by the way, for helping to answer some of the questions which don't get put on the screen. So keep an eye on the chat window. Some wonderfully encouraging and supportive comments coming through, and we really appreciate it. This is going to be for all boards, so please don't ask questions about exam-specific exam technique. There are other videos available for that and other sources of information. I think the idea here is just to clarify some concepts, some ideas, and some the ways in which you can use stuff in the exam. I didn't watch a film during the afternoon, by the way. I watched a bit of football. Here we go. So, what's the difference between the accelerator and the multiplier? Well, they're linked. The accelerator basically says that planned investment by businesses depends on the rate of growth of demand. If you think about an industry such as cloud computing, I think there was a question on video streaming services and so on and so forth. In one of the examples, paper 1, the growth of demand for video streaming, for on-demand services of all types and descriptions, video gaming, for example, that is a growth of market demand. Of course, that then is a catalyst for an increase in planned investment. Companies have to invest in server-side technologies. Companies have to invest in router switches and what have you. So when the growth of demand is strong, that tends to lead to a knock-on and positive investment effect. We call that the accelerator effect. It works the other way, by the way. When the economy slows down, companies tend to hold back on investment. They cut right back. So the accelerator is kind of useful for understanding the dynamics of the economic cycle. The multiplier is more of a mathematical number, and you will need to know the formula for the multiplier. That may vary by board. So sometimes you get a multiple choice question, or you have to do a calculation question. They'll give you some data on propensities to withdraw, import, tax, and saving, and so on and so forth. You work out the multiplier value, plug the numbers in, and you get a change. So the multiplier is the final change in GDP that comes from an initial change in aggregate demand. So, for example, the government might increase spending on road building. That will have a multiplier effect. But then construction companies might then invest to buy more diggers, to invest in more drilling equipment. That has an accelerator effect. So sometimes the multiplier and the accelerator can work in the same way and can be quite useful things to include in your analysis. So Darren, thanks for your question. Here's another question. Jim is, by the way, is released now to put these questions up. Finley asks, are there any benefits for the government running a persistent budget deficit? Well, again, evaluation is that it depends what's causing persistent government deficit. If the government is borrowing to invest in infrastructure, in social housing, in improved education, in increased spending on the NHS, if the state is spending to invest, and if they've done an assiduous cost-benefit analysis of that, and they've worked out the social benefits and what have you, and social return, you can make a case for saying the government should be free to borrow money. It's okay because there's a long-run aggregate demand and supply effect. Of course, there is something in economics called modern monetary theory, which suggests the government has no limit to how much it can borrow, which is palpable nonsense. The bond markets, as we saw in September, when Kwarteng introduced the unfunded tax cuts, suddenly straight away bond yields started going up, and the bond markets very quickly reasserted their control. So governments don't have an unlimited ability to borrow money, and clearly the higher the deficit, the more the debt goes up. Now, there's a huge debate in economics at the moment about whether or not there should be a return to some form of fiscal austerity. We should cut the deficit and cut the debt. From my point of view, I'm a Keynesian economist, brought up in the Keynesian tradition. I can see the case for improving the fiscal finances when the economy is doing well. Equally, there's a case for saying that fiscal austerity can be self-defeating, and that the fiscal austerity we saw from 2010 onwards actually has been to the detriment to the UK economy. But the government faces a very fine line between wanting to cut the deficit and not allowing the economy to go back into recession. Thank you for your question, Finley. Here's another question coming up from Rohan. Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, what is it? By the way, as I'm answering these questions, I'm sure people can produce even better answers on the screen. Now, Prebisch-Singer appears in the Edexcel spec. I hope it might appear in other specifications. If it doesn't, don't worry. So for Edexcel students, Prebisch-Singer is the idea that in the long run, those countries which extract and then export primary products, such as iron ore or lithium or copper or whatever it is, oil, the real price of those commodities tends to go down because of a low income elasticity of demand for those commodities. And hence the idea is that you should move away from that, and you should try and industrialize, move into manufacturing or services to try and avoid that. Now, keep in mind, those of you who are doing Edexcel, that Prebisch-Singer was a 1960s theory. Well, Prebisch, Peter Singer, great economists. One was at the LSE, for example. They were writing in the 1960s. Of course, what's happened since is that the prices of many primary commodities have gone up in real terms. The price of lithium used in electric batteries and things, the price of cobalt, the price of oil and gas can go up. There's no guarantee that the price of these things should go down in real terms. If anything, the price of manufactured goods has gone down with the rise of China and Bangladesh and Vietnam, etc. So Prebisch-Singer is an interesting idea. It suggests that countries should aim to industrialize and urbanize and avoid primary product dependency, but be ready to criticize it because it really is a theory that's past its sell-by date. Loads more questions coming. Charles McGill has a question. Here it is. Hopefully the session is useful. If it is, press the like button. If it isn't, we're doing our best here. But thank you to everybody in the chat who's helping out answer some other questions. It's phenomenal. Charles asks, can you use output gaps as evaluation for supply side policies, despite output gaps being a short-run concept, whereas SSP is a long-run concept? The answer is, Charles, yes, you can. Because critically, and this is a really important, you're hinting at something that's super important here. The idea of supply side policies, of course, is to increase the country's productive capacity and capabilities, okay, and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. So in theory, that creates a bigger output gap. But here's the point. Supply side policies rarely work fully unless you have enough demand in the economy. You need enough demand, aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, to be able to use or utilize the supply capacity you've created. So the challenge of central banks and governments is to maintain a sufficiently high level of demand to make use of the improved supply that your supply side policies might have achieved. Don't worry about the output gap, short run, long run, Charles. You just show it. Don't worry about it. Just include it in the diagram and you'll be absolutely fine. Okay, next question coming up is from Sean. In what situations would it be appropriate to use a liquidity trap diagram? I'm not sure you need to use a diagram for the liquidity trap. You can, if you want. Those of you who've been OCR students maybe have been taught learnable funds theory. Edexcel students sometimes get taught that. I wouldn't necessarily use a diagram. What I would do, is just to be aware of what it means and why it might be an issue. The liquidity trap basically says when central banks cut interest rates, it doesn't have much effect on demand. All kinds of reasons. Consumers are lacking confidence. They're trying to pay back debt. Banks are risk averse. So low interest rates don't really drive the economy. That's what's called a liquidity trap. There's plenty of liquidity, but the economy's trapped in a low level of demand. Probably more relevant, actually, during the pandemic, when there was a recession, probably more relevant in the aftermath of the financial crisis. There's not much evidence of a liquidity trap now because interest rates are going up, if anything, to try and control demand and to control inflation. So there we go. Here's another question. What's we got here? Ashala, what are some of the trade-offs of UK macro objectives apart from inflation and employment? Great question. Potential trade-offs include growth and inflation, growth and inequality, growth and environmental effects. So, for example, the Kuznets curve, which quite a few people have been chatting about in the chat window, the Kuznets curve is a way of trying to show the potential trade-offs between growth of GDP, per capita incomes, and the impact it has on inequality and per capita emissions. Other things, the other one would be growth, the other one would be growth and the trade balance. So when a country is expanding rapidly, typically a country's trade balance tends to worsen because we have a high propensity to import. Here's another question coming up. Tom, how can the poverty trap be analysed in an essay? Great question. A number of students actually asked me what's the difference between the poverty trap and the unemployment trap. So let me just quickly cover that as part of Tom's question. Okay, so the poverty trap is basically where people who are in work or in relative poverty, in other words, they're having an income below 60% of median, there are disincentives to them taking on extra work, earning extra money, maybe working a second part-time job, for example. And typically the poverty trap is caused by the interplay between tax and benefits. So you take on an extra job, well, you're going to have to pay income tax and national insurance. You might lose some benefits, such as universal credit. And there's the other costs as well, trying to find childcare and trying to find the cost of getting to and from work and trying to find the cost of work-related uniforms, all that kind of stuff. So the poverty trap is often where those who are in low incomes oftentimes face a much higher tax rate in effective terms than people in a higher paid job. How do you analyse it? Well, it's one of the barriers to people becoming active in the labour market or earning extra income. The valuation really is the extent to which this really does matter. And it does. In the UK, something like 11% of families are in working poverty. 4 million children live in poor households. We got the highest, I was going to say we've got the highest poverty rate in the European Union. Of course, we've now left the EU. But millions of families are one bill away from having to borrow money at high interest rates, and many families are right on the edge. They have very limited savings, and yet they find it difficult. The incentives to earn extra income are not as strong as they could be, because going to work has costs. So the unemployment trap is also basically linked to that. That means the unemployment trap basically means if you're out of work, the financial incentives to taking a job are perceived as being weak or limited. Loads of questions coming through on different things here. Here's Sam's question. Is it more powerful to argue that automatic stabilizers reduce the impact of an AD shift, or the multiplier increases the impact? I'm not too sure whether that matters, Sam. I mean, it's important to know what they are. The automatic stabilizers, if the government allows them to operate, I'll explain what they are in a second, by my estimates, probably reduces the depth of a recession by about 20%. It doesn't stop a recession. If you're going to go into a recession, you will have a recession, okay? But the automatic stabilizer is designed to reduce the depth of the downturn. What it means, of course, if the economy goes into a recession, the government takes less out in tax, but puts more money in welfare and job seekers allowance and so on and so forth. So the automatic stabilizers are quite effective, but not hugely effective. The multiplier values, that's a great question actually, Sam, the more I think about it. Most multipliers are not 3.9 or 7.6. Most multipliers are probably 1.3, 1.6. If the government spends £10 billion on a new project, it might increase GDP by, I don't know, 15 billion, because we import a lot of goods and services. We have a tax system that takes money out of the system. So the multipliers tend to be quite low in the UK. And the automatic stabilizers are fairly modest. What I would say is that the multiplier effect of government spending tends to be higher than tax cuts, because people might have saved a tax cut anyway. But critically, the multiplier effects of targeted spending, so labor-intensive construction work, social housing programs, that kind of stuff, they tend to be higher if the stimulus is timely, temporary, and targeted at the problem. Isabel has a great question. If you can find Isabel's question, come on to Ben's. Oh yeah, actually, Isabel Everett has a question. Let's do Ben's question first of all. Ben says, what policies would you suggest could increase the level of investment back in the UK economy? I do have a video, by the way, on the causes of low investment, which I did a couple of weeks back. Why is investment low? The data first. Investment in the UK is 18% of GDP. Business investment's only 11-12% of GDP. It's one of the lowest amongst high-income countries. What drives investment? Well, business confidence drives investment. Economic stability is a factor driving investment. Clearly, the government has just increased corporation tax from 19 to 25%. In theory, that's going to hit investment. But don't forget, at the same time, they brought in a 100% capital tax allowance. So businesses that spend £500,000 on capital investment can write that off against their corporate tax liability, so they don't have to pay quite as much corporate tax. What drives investment? I think having the right business structure, having the right environment for business to attract, for example, foreign direct investment. Businesses want certainty. Open markets, so competition in markets drives investment. If you increase the contestability of an industry, firms tend to invest more. And the elephant in the room, for me, of course, is the European Union. We've left the single market. Our export to GDP ratio is falling. And if we rejoin the single market, I think investment in the UK would increase, because we're closer to a much bigger economic entity. What else drives investment? It's a great question, Ben, by the way. I might give that some more thought. Here's Vesel's question. What are some examples of demand-side shocks? Well, shock is an external event which you weren't expecting. Paper 2, tomorrow, for example. Demand-side shocks, typically unexpected changes in policy. So a big rise in interest rates that you weren't expecting, a big change in the exchange rate that was outside the model, but also critically, what happens in other countries. So, for example, if Germany goes into recession, or if the US Federal Reserve keeps raising interest rates higher, beyond 5%, if the American economy this year goes into recession later on in 2023, that will have an impact on the UK. 15% of our trade is with the United States. So oftentimes, demand-side shock comes from what happens in other countries. and that has an effect on the UK because we're an open economy. Another question coming through. Can you please explain crowding out? Lucy, we covered crowding out this morning, beautifully done by people in the student collective, but very quickly. Crowding out is when the government spends more and borrows more to expand the size of the state, to expand the economy. That can sometimes crowd out the private sector. What that means is that the government might borrow more. They might have to raise the interest rate on debt to pay for the bonds they issue. And if interest rates go up in the economy, that squeezes mortgage. People want a mortgage. Businesses might spend less on investment if they have to pay more interest on their loans. Or if the government borrows more, it might tax more ultimately. So we all have to pay higher taxes. And therefore, we have less to spend. So we get crowded out. And there's another aspect, which is resource crowding out, where the government, I don't know, for example, the government spends billions on big infrastructure projects. Those labour resources might have been used in the private sector. So government investing more, employing more, might squeeze out the private sector. Keynesians argue that there's less chance of crowding out, in fact, more chance of crowding in. Government spending can expand the economy. There's a question about Finlay on balance of payments. I just want to cover if we can find Finlay's question on balance of payments. But here's another one. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Finlay Shaw's question. What are the downsides to an excess in the balance of payments? Finlay, there's no such thing as an excess in the balance of payments. Let me just quickly go through again. This is super important. A lot of students are a little bit flaky on balance of payments. Let me quickly go through again. I did a live stream on the balance of payments, and the recording is available for those who want to drop into that. The balance of payments for a country has three main component parts. First of all, the current account. Current account is trading goods and services, net primary income, and net secondary income. Okay, so the current account for the UK, for example, our current account is about -4, -5% of GDP. We run a current account deficit. Okay, other countries run surpluses: Singapore, Norway, South Korea, Germany, for example. If you're running a current account deficit of, let's say, 4% of GDP, you have to balance your accounts. The balance of payments is always zero. So there's something called the financial account. Capital account can be ignored. There's something called the financial account. So if you're running a current account deficit, you need to run a financial account surplus. In other words, you need to have a net inflow of capital coming in, financial flows coming into the economy. How does that happen? One, you might be attractive to inflows of foreign direct investment. Happy days, you can balance your payments up. Two, you might have relatively high interest rates, which attracts hot money flows. Great, that helps the balance of payments on the financial account. Three, the government might be borrowing money and international investors might be piling into UK government bonds. That's an inflow of money, fine for the balance of payments, helps finance our external deficit. Fourthly, a load of foreign money might flow into equity markets, companies listing on the UK stock market, or into Edinburgh, Glasgow, London property from overseas. So there's a lot of financial flows that come into a country, sometimes hard to measure, but they help to balance our balance of payments, hopefully. And of course, you hope that, let's say, for example, sake of argument, let's say we were running a 4% deficit on the current account, and we managed to attract, I don't know, 3% of GDP on financial inflows. We're still -1 down. In that situation, you have to reduce your gold and foreign currency reserves using the IMF adjustment mechanism. And then the balance of payments sums to zero. Now, those of you advising development tonight, economic development, you might be thinking about Sri Lanka or Turkey. For sure, you might be thinking about Zambia and lots of other countries that are in deep trouble with their balance of payments. They're basically running out of foreign exchange because they're running huge trade deficits, current account deficits. There's capital flight out of their economy. Investors aren't piling in, they're piling out. And as a result, a country is running up against a balance of payments crisis, which means they're running out of foreign exchange. Hence, Ghana and Zambia, and one or two other countries, are having to go to the IMF for emergency funding. I think the IMF are providing Sri Lanka with $3 billion and Ghana with something similar to replenish their foreign exchange reserves so they can cover their import requirements. So, for example, Sri Lanka is having to Well, the problem is when you borrow money to pay the interest on what you already owe. But Sri Lanka cannot afford to import drugs, pharmaceuticals, vaccines used in their health service. So if you get bitten by a dog and you get rabies, there's no vaccine available in Sri Lanka to save you. So when countries run out of foreign exchange reserves, that is a huge problem. UK will never run out of foreign exchange reserves, but for many low-income, smaller countries that run into these balance of payment problems, that can happen. Long answer, Finley. I hope it kind of made sense, but do check out our balance of payments video if you want to work that one out. Jacob says, great question from Jacob, can you please explain the Marshall-Lerner conditions? Happily, Jacob. By the way, in the exam, you don't need the maths. All you need to know is that a exchange rate depreciation or a devaluation, and if Holly was here, she said it depends on floating versus fixed exchange rates. All you need to know is that if the currency falls in value, it will improve the trade balance over time, providing the sum of price elasticity for exports plus price elasticity for imports is greater than 1. Explain that. Let me explain that, Jacob. What that means is when the currency depreciates, you should be selling more exports because they should be cheaper. Now, you hope you sell a lot more exports, and you need that. You need the elasticity to be high for that to happen. But on the other hand, your imports become more expensive. Now, if you've got a low price elasticity for imports and the price goes up, you're going to spend more on imports, which will worsen the trade balance. There's a great answer this morning when we discussed this, saying that oftentimes businesses are contracted to buy a given quantity of imports, but the price can go up and down. So you're contracted to buy 50,000 tons of cement from whatever, Poland, and the pound falls against the Polish zloty, you're going to spend more on that cement. So the trade balance between the UK and Poland will worsen. So Marshall-Lerner, basically, if the elasticities are big enough over time, your trade balance should improve. Just need to know that, Jacob. You don't need to prove it in the exam. Ollie Freeman asks, what does the Kuznets curve show? Well, the Kuznets curve basically shows a changing relationship between, on the one hand, on the x-axis, you have per capita as you're heading that way. You have rising per capita incomes. And on the y-axis, you can measure inequality, that's measured by the Gini coefficient, or you can have CO2 emissions per capita, some sort of environmental index. Kuznets curve basically suggests that as countries become richer, initially inequality gets worse and pollution emissions get worse. But there may come a point where as countries become sufficiently rich, they manage to achieve a fall in inequality and a fall in environmental pollution. And it's all to do with things like having welfare systems, having pollution policies in place like carbon trading and carbon permits, that kind of stuff of paper one, I think, wasn't it? So Kuznets curve quite handy, particularly if you get a question on living standards and environmental consequences. Oh, yeah. Here's a great question. Yeah, how is regulating financial markets important for macro stability? Wow. Interesting question. Okay, so financial markets. Depends how much you get taught on this. I teach a lot of financial market economics. I would say to this question, when you have unstable financial markets, there is a big risk of that, of what I call the externalities of financial instability. So, for example, think about the global financial crisis back in 2007, 2008. We've all paid the price of that, pretty much, either in terms of higher taxes or cuts in public spending affecting fiscal austerity, or simply that we're just poorer than we would have been but for the crisis. I think one of the former Bank of England's former chief economist, he's now at the RSA actually, he said that it was about £20,000 per household, the cost of the global financial crisis, in terms of lost income, higher taxes, consequences and things of bailouts and higher government debt. Andy Haldane is now at the head of the RSA. He was the Bank of England's chief economist. So why is financial stability important? Why is it important for macro stability? Without financial stability, businesses less likely to invest, banks less likely to lend out. If you have an unstable financial system, countries far less attractive to inward investment. Just look at financial crisis in Sri Lanka. If you look at one video tonight, look at Sri Lanka, a country that's I'm looking forward to visiting shortly, a country that is rich in all kinds of different ways. It's a middle-income country. It's got twice the per capita income of India, highly educated labour force, phenomenal tourism, farming sector, interesting emerging sectors in software engineering and so on and so forth. Sri Lanka, a country that should be doing really well post the end of the Civil War, but it's now embroiled in financial crisis and the economy is imploding. Deep recession, collapse in living standards, poverty, extreme poverty in Sri Lanka has doubled in the space of 2 years. They've lost 20 years of growth in per capita incomes in the space of 2 years. Hyperinflation, pretty much, or very high inflation, capital fly to currency that's in free fall. That's why regulating financial markets is important, because the absence of financial market regulations is a catalyst for instability. How you get there is up to you. So if it's banking regulation, if it's having stress tests and things, there's a lot of detail with financial markets, and you'll have revised that, sure. But I think the bigger picture is, why is it important? Because financial instability creates negative externalities. Finlay has a great question about trade blocks. We can find that, but let's check this lovely question first of all. What is the difference between discretionary fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers? Great question. Let's take a sip of water there. Automatic stabilizers happen automatically. So when the economy goes into a downturn, government spending goes up, tax revenues go down, and the budget deficit rises. So it automatically helps to stabilize demand. Whereas discretionary fiscal policy is deliberate decisions by the government to change tax, to change real pay of teachers and doctors and nurses, deliberate decisions to curtail HS2, which I don't think, by the way, were built in my lifetime. So discretionary fiscal policy is basically the deliberate decisions of government on tax and spend. Was automatic stabilizers happen pretty much without having to do anything because they just linked to the economic cycle. There we go. 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes. So keep those questions coming. Here's a great question from Finlay. I think we've had two from Finlay, but apologies if you haven't missed a question. Can you explain the benefits of trading blocks and currency unions? Well, great question. Keep in mind, of course, Brexit's not on the spec. Okay, it will be on the next spec, believe me. They don't have to ask you a question about the European Union. They could ask you a question about the African continental free trade area, or the East Asian single market, so the East African single market, or ASEAN, which is trying to develop a single market. They could ask you any kind of question they like. They can give any context they want, but the basic principles remain the same. Trading blocks. Well, let's take, for example, a free trade area. You just eliminate tariffs and quotas and other forms of tariff and non-tariff barrier. And the aim is to create trade between countries. UK, of course, post-Brexit, is signing many free trade deals, most of which are copy and paste jobs from the deals we had as part of the European Union. That's by the by. Then you move to customs union, which is a free trade area. That's a trading bloc, but with a common external tariff around it. So the European Union, of course, has a 10% tariff on cars, been in the news recently. But every country inside the EU imposes the same tariff on cars or the same tariff on wheat. So you have a trading bloc, which is a customs union. That can morph into a single market, which is a customs union plus free movement of goods and services, labour and capital. And then, of course, a currency union is where you eliminate exchange rates within a single market, and each country shares the same currency. Now, each of these has their own benefits. Trade creation, in terms of trying to stimulate trade and investment within participating nations. There's also trade diversion effects as well, which can sometimes be negative. But critically, just basically trying to increase intra-regional trade within a community. And the European Union has been spectacularly successful in many ways. I think the really interesting one is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, whether that can successfully act as a catalyst for trade and investment. You see, Africa only does 11% of its trade within Africa. It needs to lift that up to 25-30% to really drive poverty reduction. Okay, cool. How are we doing? Two more questions. Here's Ben's question. Are free market supply side reforms to labour markets more beneficial than interventionist policies? Great question, Ben. Wow. I assume you mean free market policies that will be things like privatization and moving towards a much more flexible labour market, the gig economy, 0 hours contracts, perhaps a fall in unionisation, and also critically, I'm not sure, but maybe a much more open policy towards immigration. By the way, the immigration data comes out next week, and it's going to be staggering how high the net migration has been into the UK economy in the last year. It'll be closer to 1 million than 500,000. So free market reforms, of course you want to make the labour market work better, of course you do. You want competitive labour markets. You want to address monopoly power in the labour market. You want the market to allocate workers efficiently. I think there's lots of cases for saying free market policies are important in reducing some of the barriers to finding work. So I'm a big believer, for example, in open migration, in particular skills-based migration. And I also think there's big arguments for having flexible labour markets, including hybrid working, part-time working, less so 0 hours contracts, but often it does benefit both employer and employee. On the other hand, there are lots and lots of labour market failures. Immobility of labour, occupation and geographical, inequality, working poverty, economic inactivity. And well-targeted, well-planned supply-side reforms can have a significant effect on that. So, skilled work visa programs, a higher minimum wage, legal protection for unions. I guess trading, not much labour market stuff on our paper on Monday. I think the labour market will appear probably more on paper 3, who knows, but wasn't much on paper 1. How are we doing? So, Ollie says, why does unemployment change in the short run, but in the long run it always returns to the fixed point? Well, the long and Phillips curve, I prefer to use the concept of the NAIRU. I know there is something called the long and Phillips curve. I'm just going to draw it now myself, just to remind me. The long and Phillips curve is based on the idea of the natural rate of unemployment. And the idea here is that unemployment reverts back to the natural rate. So, which is nonsense, by the way. When I was taught the Phillips curve at Cambridge 40 years ago, I thought it was nonsense then. I think it's nonsense now. So I actually don't believe in the concept of the long and Phillips curve. I mean, you can draw it because the theory says you have to draw it. Why does unemployment always return to the fixed point? Because they assume that the economy the labour market is like a freely functioning market, and that wages are flexible and that prices are flexible and that workers and employers bargain. It's nonsense, right? What really matters, Ollie, is not the long run Phillips curve. It's the changing gradient of the short run Phillips curve at something called the NAIRU. NAIRU, NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Essentially what that means is that when the Phillips curve becomes inelastic, as unemployment falls, you may well get some higher inflation. So that's where the NAIRU is, of course, is open to debate, open to discussion. It's not one single point, by the way. The evidence is that unemployment in the UK, inflation in the UK tends to rise when unemployment falls below 4% of the labour force. So we get these labour shortage effects and wages start rising. It'd be great to get unemployment down to 3% through having really effective supply-side policies, childcare subsidies, proper retraining schemes, skill-based migration, levelling up policies, etc. So to answer your question, Ollie, unemployment does not always return. The monetarists argue it does, but they've had their day in the sun. And the idea for me that there's a natural rate of, there's nothing natural, by the way, about unemployment. I'm going to throw some shade here. There is nothing natural about unemployment. There's also nothing voluntary about unemployment. The vast majority of people who are unemployed want to work. You've got to understand the reasons why they're not in work and the consequences of, obviously, the social and economic consequences. So I don't believe in the natural rate. I probably wouldn't draw it. I'd just draw the short run Phillips curve and then build in a little dotted line showing the NAIRU, which is basically where the Phillips curve becomes inelastic. Okay, evaluate some policies that could improve an economy like in Sri Lanka. Well, where do you start? First of all, you've got to get a grip on inflation. You've got to try and stabilise the exchange rate. The fundamental problems in Sri Lanka is family-based corruption. That Sri Lanka has, I think, a corruption ranking of 99 out of 190 nations. Deep-rooted corruption, government failure. They've borrowed huge amounts of money, mainly from China, which they can't repay. So it saddens me, and I've got good friends, teachers who love Sri Lanka, and they think it's one of the worst examples of governing failure, macro policy failure they've ever seen. So where do you start? You basically have to get a grip on inflation. So you've got to control price inflation, you've got to stabilize the exchange rate, and you have got to engage in some anti-corruption reforms. George says, I can't tell if I'm listening to George, Geoff Riley, or John McDonnell. Wow, interesting. Yeah, and George asked me a question a little while ago, saying if I was stuck in a lift with Rachel Reeve or Jeremy Hunt, who would I most like to have some bants with? The answer, George, and you're not going to like this, by the way, is Rachel Reeves. She is a serious economist. She was at the Bank of England and very, very highly thought of. Jeremy Hunt, I think, has lots of qualities as well. But Rachel Reeve, I think, will be a pretty good Chancellor of the Exchequer, if and when it happens. Let's ask a few more questions. Finlay says, is it Jim selecting questions? I think, Finlay, the answer is yes. What's your favourite Nando's meal? Well, thanks for that. The first person I ever taught is now CEO of Nando's. Find him out on LinkedIn. Nando's, for me, it's 10 chicken wings with some fries and some lovely flatbread with chili and hummus drizzle. Well, hummus, obviously, let's get that right. 10 chicken wings, some fries, bottomless drink, and then some flatbread with hummus and chili drizzle. In fact, I'm tempted to order one right now. A few more questions. There's do you know my teacher, Mr. Nutter? Indeed, I do. Great friend of mine, great friend over many years, superb teacher, wonderful writer, examiner, one of the great economics teachers of his generation, a wonderful man. There's a question that's coming about dumping. Come back to that in a second. Jacob, over the last few weeks, I've spent more time watching Geoff and Jim than my girlfriend. She's starting to get jealous thoughts. Well, does she do economics, Jacob? And if she does she prefer micro or macro? These are questions to which I think we all want the answer. Why would foreign firms choose to do dumping? Great question. Well, it's actually second-degree price discrimination. So typically firms dump if they want to offload excess capacity. It's a big issue, by the way, if you get a question on protectionism, steel, that kind of stuff, allegations of dumping, where companies in countries with excess supply offload their products at low prices to try and use up spare capacity and perhaps inflict commercial damage on producers in other countries. Did I actually teach the Nando's CEO? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. In fact, he was in the first class I ever taught 37 years ago. Freddie says, how do I buy you a pint after you say it's my economics, Freddie? Well, first of all, I drink halves. In fact, I can make a half last a fortnight if I really want to. Aaron says, can you shout out Mr. Hobday, please? Absolutely prepared to do that. See, we've got some amazing economics teachers out there, some amazing teachers, full stop, who have supported you for the last couple of years. I am in awe of the people who've taught you and supported you as we've all worked our way through the pandemic. A great question from Will Stubbs, who actually, Will, was shortlisted for the Tutor to You Economist of the Year in the Student Collective. Will, you're in the top 10, by the way. Shout out to Dr. Challenger's Grammar School, I think. Who's your favourite member of the Tutor to You Collective? Well, it's time to make our awards. I am delighted to say that the winner of the Tutor to You Student Year of the Award is a joint winner. It's Rosetta and it's George. Congratulations to both. Can we give them a shout out, please, in the chat window? Everybody has made a huge contribution over the years, but I think Rosetta and George, just on balance, have made an amazing contribution. I think if both get in touch with Jim, maybe through the usual channels, we will get something to you, some merch to you. Mr. Poon, the first creation asked Mr. Poon, can I have a shout out? Alex says, well done, lads. Well, Rosetta might take issue with that, Alex, but congratulations. Yeah, where's Messi? I'm fuming. A lot of people saying that Messi was robbed. Well, he's earned enough money. If he's robbed, it's okay. Yeah, a lot of people saying the Riddler. Yeah, okay, but that's the way it is. I've made my decision. What are we going to say? Okay, so here's the plans. First of all, have a good luck, by the way, tomorrow. I just wish you the best. Keep revising, stay calm and confident. You'll be fine. But just hope you have a great night tonight revising. If you've enjoyed our revision streams, I think we're up to number 20 now since the start of Easter, which is phenomenal. And many of you have been to all of them, which is incredible. If you could press the like button, that'd be amazing. It helps other people find us. But more important than that, it's been absolutely incredible supporting you, hopefully finding useful sessions and things, and the content, the contributions in the chat window have been just spectacularly good. So the plan is, good luck tomorrow. We take a breather. I'll probably come back midway through half term. We'll do a few synoptic sessions, targeting Edexcel particularly, but AQA and other boards as well. We'll do some synoptic papers, and then we're done, aren't we? Then we just wait for the results. Now, other streams are available. But it's just a time for me to. Can we also give a massive shout out to Jim in the chat window? Jim's been my producer, putting the questions and the answers up, and basically running the show. So I'm doing some more sessions, but after tomorrow, it'll be about a week or 10 days before we kick off again with preparation for synoptic. Super important point, by the way. All the stuff you revised for paper 1 and paper 2, you can use in paper 3. There's no new material to learn. Just refresh, upload, update, you'll be fine. So whatever you revise for paper 2 and paper 1, it's in the bank, and you'll be able to bring that into play in paper 3. Whatever happens tomorrow, stay calm, stay happy, stay positive, stay curious, and see you sometime soon.